Welcome, everybody. You're listening to Pastured Poultry Talk. I am your host, Mike Badger, and this is episode 108. We're knee-deep in an introductory series to Pastured Poultry. I call it a Pastured Poultry training series. We're going to continue that series this time with pasture, housing, and management. Pasture management is the reason that you are different, folks. It is the reason you charge a premium for your stuff. It is what we hinge all of our existence on. Well, maybe not. Now I'm getting crazy, right? But we're going to talk about pasture management, pasture housing. We're going to talk about why it's important, how to get started raising pasture poultry on the pasture, right? This is an introductory training series, so there's a lot of questions usually that crop up around housing and things like that. So we're going to get there, but before we do, we got to lay a foundation. We're going to do that. Essentially, for the technical piece of this, I'm going to walk through a presentation that I gave at Stone Barns in New York, above New York City, in 2019, that I think addresses most of the common questions that people have when they're about ready to get started. We need some background information here, so you're going to have to eat these vegetables before we get into the nuts and bolts of our discussion today. And don't worry, it won't be long. It won't be a lot. I advocate, and APA advocates, that pastured poultry will require two foundational things. Pasture, that's grasses, that's legumes, the vegetation that's grown in soil that supports insect life that your birds also forage on. And the second thing is frequent movement. That's deliberate rotation to fresh pasture. And the birds live outside as appropriate for the age of the birds and the season of the year on the grass, on the pasture, right? They're living on the pasture, not access. We won't go into that word game on this episode, but birds living on pasture for the majority of their life. This brings me really to a kind of a conversation I had in the Pastured Poultry Talk Facebook group, which is this podcast's official Facebook presence is the Pastured Poultry Talk Facebook group. Look it up, join us, and have some conversations. But one of the commenters basically said, I just joined APA because you convinced me, but I don't agree with your definition of pasture. Fair enough. The tag-on kind of sentiment there was that this person favored the La Belle Rouge model in France, which basically has a shed and birds that go outside into the pasture. So they're inside at night in a shed. They're foraging outside on the pasture. I don't really think rotation or movement is a part of that system. I don't know enough about it. So I've mentioned that in a previous episode. In addition, the commenter said that heritage birds were smart enough to move themselves to fresh pasture. Okay, fair enough. I don't really care that people don't agree with the definition, right? I do believe that when you define something and when you assert to claim something high and premium, that you have to set a high bar, you have to have a line in the sand, you have to be exclusionary. Otherwise, everybody is in the game and then it becomes nothing. And that's what happens with a lot of products as they become commoditized, is the level of effort to comply with a high ideal doesn't bring more people in. It's that those people who are not achieving that high ideal try to pull the standard or pull the definition or pull the entry point down closer to their level, and they weaken it. But that's a whole probably series on its own. But here's what I wrote in response to that comment. And it was basically that I agree with the premise of the argument that a pasture model can vary based on flock size and the breed of chicken. But I believe there's a point where that continuous grazed fixed barn model will degrade the pasture. I'd love to have some ins and outs of the La Belle Rouge program here and actually ask questions and understand how they deal with overgrazing on the pasture. That's not part of my response. That's just an aside. But back to my response, I'd also say that the pasture's role isn't solely for the chicken's benefit. The pasture is there to receive the benefit of the chickens. The purpose of an intentional grazing rotation is to impart an impact on the pasture and not simply let the birds graze on their favorite stuff. There's an impact, rest, regenerate cycle. I also think it's important to consider that the movement's founder, i.e. Mr. Joel, considers movement to fresh pasture to be a defining aspect of pastured poultry. Over the years, he's shied away from being prescriptive in a lot of details about what that means. And he will definitely make an argument about which methods he thinks work best to achieve that movement. But the reality is I can quickly think of at least 4 grazing models that pastured poultry producers may deploy. And as we go through here, we'll work through some of those grazing models in the second half of this podcast discussion. So I close it up and say that I just don't know enough about the La Belle Rouge program to be able to love it or hate it. I don't have a natural romance for Europe or France, so I need more information to set a good opinion, right? Giving a nod here to the fact that, many people, especially here in the U.S., will just look to whatever Europe does. And if Europe's doing it, they're complete fanboys and they're like, oh yeah, it's great. I'm not like that. I could care less what they do. But if their chicken program is good, I want to know enough details about it to figure out why it's good. Saying that you want to be like them, nobody's ever given me the details, the point-by-point comparison to that system to pastured poultry to actually make me even get excited about it from a production standpoint. From a marketing standpoint, I can see a lot of value in what the La Belle Rouge program is. That's where we left off that comment. And I think a little bit harder about these differences of opinion. And I'm not talking about the people who want to cheat the model. I'm not talking about the vitals or the cooks who want to really lower the standard to their level. I'm talking about people who look at it, who maybe are raising heritage breeds and think, hey, you know what? My birds seem to do okay. And I think there's a flock size demographic in there that I'd like to really ferret out over the years. But when I think about this difference, I think sometimes I'm starting to see pastured poultry, and this is not necessarily an aha moment by reading a Facebook comment. This is a change in nuance or a shift in perspective for me that's gradually occurring talking with some of the stalwarts of our community. And that is the simple question, what if you thought of your pastured poultry operation as a soil health management tool first? We have to sell chicken to make money. So a lot of us look at chicken, and we look at chicken and how do we want to raise chicken in a premium way? We put it on pasture, and we know that there's some benefits there and that everybody gets some benefits spread around, but we're mainly looking at the chicken. I'm being a little generalized here, but we're mainly looking at the chicken, and we're thinking about everything through the lens of the chicken. But what if that chicken was nothing more than a tool to do what my good friend Will Harris told me? Maybe, is he a good friend? I'm not sure. We're friends. I visited Will Harris here going into the Jacksonville conference, the Apple conference in Florida last year. And Will said something to me that stuck. I think I might have mentioned this in a previous podcast. If not, I've mentioned it some other places that I talk. I talk a lot of places, I guess. But Will told me that he's not really raising chicken. His product is healthy soil. He's regenerating the land. And that's his marketable message. Can you market that message? I think it's pretty incredible. And it's not a completely new thought to me, but the way that Will says it when he's talking about his birds and his soil and his land, when he's out there in his farm, it all clicks. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of what I've been thinking about as pastured poultry. And so when I think about this divide in, should I move them every day, or can I do a wagon wheel, or can I do movement every 3 days, or can I just put them in a barn and open the door up at 8 a.m. every morning? What if you thought of pastured poultry as a soil health management tool? What if it was a tool to manage your land, and an offshoot of that, a byproduct of that management tool, was a carcass or an egg? And I think when we start looking at those kind of discussions, I think to understand the pastured model, it kind of starts with that connection, the soil health and the chicken connection, a unison, a yin and yang type of thing. And then it goes into the kind of the original idea, if you read Pastured Poultry Profits, is a multi grazing, stackable enterprise is pastured poultry. It fits a role inside of a bigger ecosystem of grazing, of land management, of haying. And so our farms, if you look at most of our farms, with some obvious exceptions, you can find them, is what I mean by obvious. You will find that pastured poultry is integrated. It's a piece of something else working in unison on the land. We can answer a lot of questions about the how we do what we do when we consider a broader holistic context. And I think it really, really hurts us and gets bogged down if we spend all of our time arguing about moving every day or moving every 7 days or moving every month versus, the principle. And we have to maintain a principle, which is movement to fresh pasture. I think that's a non-negotiable principle. How do we achieve that? That the methods, I think, are many. The methods can be many. And I think there's a lot of variables that play into that method. We won't get to all of those variables today, but these are things that as you investigate pasture poultry, as you grow, as you experiment with a model that works on your farm, as you see the land response to the pressure that you give to the land through your chickens, these things you'll start to form an opinion that's true for your circumstances, rooted in that principle, right? The principles are few, the methods are many. It comes down to this, less and less people, I think, these days think this, but putting birds on pasture is not just some beautiful hippie dream where everything needs to commune with nature, right? That's a quippy way to think about that, but it really is that management piece of it. And it reminds me, I'm going to quote a verse here in Luke that I think really summarizes how I'm thinking about pastured poultry as a production model, as a method of raising chickens. As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but it could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. Now, this passage is talking to believers about Jesus, the rock, and putting in deep foundations with that. But in a pasture poultry foundation, we have the same thing, don't we? If you build your pasture poultry business on the foundations of the model, of the principles of pasture poultry, if you understand the principles, in other words, pasture poultry is about birds raised outside on pasture for the majority of their life in fresh forage, in movement. That is the keystone that spreads out and benefits everything else. It builds the soil health. It builds the pasture health. It builds the health and welfare of the chicken. It increases the nutrient density of your chicken or egg. And when you go in and put that product into commerce, then it strengthens community relationships, because we still are primarily a direct marketed, consumer touch, face-to-face environment that's changing and branching out, but primarily we're direct to market. So there's a community aspect, a heavy community aspect. And then that community aspect, pasture poultry, it reaches its web a little further out, and it boosts that economy, where the economy is simply emboldened by that direct market, that farmer selling to the community, buying feed from the community mill, buying supplies, buying processing, doing all the infrastructure required to make that farm run, that's circulating food dollars inside of the community more and more, and just strengthening it. So pasture poultry, when you think about that, is a foundation. So why do we want to look for ways to shortcut the model, right? If I have 10,000 layers and I want to pasture them, that's a serious undertaking. And we have members, we have community members who are raising 10,000, 20,000, even 40,000 pasture poultry layers in movement-based systems. But if you want to run that scale and you want to on a farm, why do you want to short your foundation by putting them in a barn and opening up a door? Because we all know, we're all smart enough to know, you will be smart enough to know what chickens do to a continuously grazed pasture. You don't build the foundation when you short the model. when you short the principal. I think that's the discussion. There's nuances, there's variables in there. But as we talk about some of the nuts and bolts of pasture management here, of actually the on-pasture production of what you're setting out to do, these are observations you'll make. These are observations maybe it helps to have ahead of time. These are observations. These are thinkings that have come to me over the last 10 years, being plugged into thousands of my own birds and probably millions of the community members' birds when I talk with farmers all across the country and even, dare I say, the world. Where do we go from there? Well, I'll tell you where we go. We thank our sponsor, Premier One. Premier has been providing electric fencing, electric netting, and sheep and goat supplies. We got to get the ruminants in there somehow, right? And poultry products for 40 years. And they've tacked on expert advice how to use them because they use those products every day. So when you call Premier, you're getting good, sound advice. You know, about 10 years ago, I purchased my first portable electrifiable fence from Premier. I still have that fence. I'm going to order some more. I like the heavy duty perma fences for my woods. I like to graze inside of one of those, a little taller, a little sturdier, and they're 100-foot rolls pieces. I've actually upgraded some earlier this year, and I just like it. It's relatively lightweight. I can still manage it myself, but Premier's poultry net, the other stuff, the longer stuff, the lighter stuff is lightweight. It's easy to move. It deters ground predators, you know, when you have it properly energized. And when you do that, when you have an electric netting and a good energizer on there with a nice high voltage and amperage running through it, it will literally protect your bottom line by keeping your flock safe. You know, and if you do need help matching your energizers to your fence, they can help you do that. So if you're looking for fences that work from the people who use them every day, contact Premier at 800-282-6631 or visit pasturedpoultrytalk.com/premier to request your informational catalog. And by all means, please tell them Mike Badger with Pastured Poultry Talk sent you. I'd also like to thank show sponsor Windy Meadows Hatchery. Windy Meadows supplies pasture poultry farmers with day-old broiler chicks from their family-owned hatchery in Northeast Texas. And when I say family-owned, they've all got it going on. There's the Hales have the division of labor set up. They're a model farm to look at in this regard. But Daniel launched the hatchery. He works with Benjamin. How you doing, Benjamin? Thank you for generously sponsoring the podcast. I know you guys have been calling Benjamin. He mentioned that you're ordering chicks from him and you're coming and being referred from the podcast. So please give Benjamin a call. They're Northeast Texas. They can do pickups and they can ship to wherever you're at in the country. So Windy Meadows brings a family scale and family touch to the day-old chick business, and it's just refreshing. If you're in need of day-old broiler chicks at a competitive price, I recommend you contact Windy Meadows Hatchery. They got to be on your call list. So check them out, see what they can do for you, and just don't wait for the last minute, right? Don't call up on Friday and say, can you ship me chicks on Monday? That's just bad planning on your part. Give it some time, give it some lead time, and see what you got. So if you want to find out more information, visit pasturedpoultrytalk.com/WMH and tell them Mike Badger sent you, please. One more quick call out here. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about pasture shelters. One of the things I'll do is I'll put a lot of links inside of the show notes for this episode, which you'll find when you visit the Pastured Poultry Talk website. But I'm also going to provide a link to John Siskovich's stress-free chicken tractor plans. And he's got some other books and binders and informational packets that he's put together over the years that are really geared towards, you know, that first chicken type of producer, right? You have a lot of questions. You need to know what to do. John's put a lot of work into building that information. And I really like John's chicken tractor design. We talked about it on a previous episode. I'll put that link in the show notes. But I'm going to also give you an affiliate link here to purchase John's chicken tractor plans. They're inexpensive. You can buy a PDF or a printed version. But if you visit pasturedpoultrytalk.com/John, that's JOHN, very simple, pasturedpoultrytalk.com/John, that will redirect you to John's store where you can shop his products. And highly recommend the stress-free tractor. book. It's step-by-step, cut lists, illustrations. It's a 6x10 tractor, good for, 30 birds, 40 birds maybe, depending on your age and how far you take them. Easy to build, easy in. They're designed to be moved. When I was looking to redo some shelters here in the spring, John's design was on my mind. It fits so many of the things that I need to do, which is be nimble, move shelters from the house to the wood pasture the chicken woods, I guess I'm calling it these days, which is about 1/8 of a mile away. Manage some smaller groupings of breeder birds. And I talked to John in one of the earlier episodes of Pastured Poultry Talk and kind of got his bicycling journey, his start into farming. And we talked about the genesis of his Pastured Poultry shelter design. So I'll link that also in the show notes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into some pasture management discussions. All right, so this information is really important, so I'm going to repeat this. It might be a little repetitive based on my monologue, but it's kind of in a different light. So the question here is, why pastured? And we think about pasture health. So you're rebuilding soil, you're distributing manure where it's needed. So there's a more even distribution of manure. You're not hauling manure or a lot of manure out of your barn or hauling it off farm. You're putting it where you need it. And pasture health, there's a pasture sanitation aspect to this, to having birds out there. That's part of the multi-species stacked grazing model. In terms of bird health, the bird health, really a foundation here is moving that bird away from its own manure, right? Cornish crosses is easy to see when you have a daily move system. You have, birds, they manure up an area. Every day you move them away from their manure and you give them fresh, clean access to vegetation that they will forage on, but also clean vegetation that they will manure up, but they get them off of their dirt. So they're never living on a buildup of their manure. They're always starting with a fresh diaper every day. They get access to sunshine. They get supplemental forage, which is important for, taste and nutrition. And in the human health, key benefits here, you have a higher omega-3 level, which brings down a lower omega-6 to 3 ratio. If you don't know what those means, we'll try to maybe do a podcast episode with a nutritionist at some point. I think that'd be good. But you have higher levels of vitamins D and E, and for eggs, you have A. And there's lots of information there at appa.org/nutrition. It's been studied, laboratory tests, even academic, peer-reviewed, published studies verify the information I just said. And there's lots of community health aspects to work out. The local food economies, the transparent food systems. And I would even add here, COVID-19 has shown us that, a pastured poultry model is indicative of a local food system that is responsive, diverse. It's able to respond in ways that the integrated models can't. The integrated models are slaughtering, that's not even the wrong word. They're destroying viable birds because they don't have a market anymore for the birds. And so they don't go through the extra expense of processing them. Or a distribution or a food service outlet has shut down and is no longer available to the integrator. So they can't run birds through that plant in order to sell the birds. They know where to go with them. So they, rather than spend the millions of dollars to retool a line and the months of work to do it, I don't know if you just heard that. That's my cat and dog chasing each other. They're not flexible enough to adapt to those changing markets. So the birds that were destined for those markets are destroyed. There's no place else for them to go. And that's what we saw in the COVID-19 poultry processing stuff. Pasture poultry producers, on the other hand, are responsive. They can respond to those changes in markets. It's not easy. I don't think I've seen anybody who said that was easy. I don't think anybody who says they're necessarily convinced that they had to make those changes, that they're out of the woods yet, but they're still in business. They're still adapting. They're capable of adapting. They're not destroying, tens of thousands of birds out on pasture. That's my point. In this pasture poultry understanding, we need to set some things up right off the bat and danced around this a little bit, but, pastured poultry is different than organic. It's different than free range. It's different than cage free. Pasture poultry is always cage free, right? If you define cages as, a wire cage that gives a laying hen, for example, 100 inches of living space, spacious 100 inches of living space. And I think that's hard for consumers, especially with the organic and the free range idea. There's a natural inclination there for customers to believe that organic and free range mean pastured. And that is just not the case. Free range gives you access to the outdoors. That's a legal definition. It gives you access to the outdoors. The open secret in the poultry industry is that the barn doors never really have to open. You can always have a reason, even for organic birds, organic poultry production in a CAFO, that the barns never have to open because it could be too cold, it could be too hot, it could rain, it could be that there was a risk of highly pathogenic avian influenza 2 years ago, so they still had the barn doors closed. Seriously, it's I'm not really exaggerating. I wish I was. But that's the hard thing to wrap our head around. That makes the words we use very important. And what we see creep into the conversation, as I alluded to earlier in the podcast in my monologue, was the idea of a competitive pasture force in the market. And that competitive pasture force is using a third-party certification, certified humane, if you're not aware of it, to market pasture-raised eggs and pasture-raised chicken for a premium over conventionally raised poultry, but at a method that doesn't live up to the ideals of what pastured poultry is and has been for 3 decades. And so that's a real challenge. And one of the nuances when you evaluate those labeling claims, you see that there's a word game going on. Those birds coming out of those systems have access to pasture. They're pasture raised, pasture access, right? Pasture access. Pasture access means they're living in a barn. The barns probably open more frequently than they do in a CAFO organic. But whether or not the entire flock gets outside is debatable. We know enough about chicken behavior to say that it's probably the case that all the birds do not go outside every day, or maybe even ever. There's an uneven distribution there. And if they were to go outside, they wouldn't be able to utilize their pasture effectively anyway. So, and you see that when you see pictures of these places where the pasture is either all an even height and there's like 10 birds in focus or 50 birds in focus out of a 20,000 bird barn or 10,000 bird barn running around the pasture that's, twice as tall as them, or if you do happen to see pictures of a place where the birds have grazed, you're going to see a ring around the barn and it's going to be dirt. There's going to be a very defined dirt area, and the pasture impact will get less and less until it's not utilized. And that's not the picture that we paint when we say pasture. So these things are important. And what I want you to understand is when you say pasture raised, it has to mean something. It has to stand for something. And you have to defend that stance and be willing to step out and say, this is pasture raised, this is not. APA has some really great resources coming online and really has been online to help with this. We're taking a line in the stand. We're saying this is pasture, this is not. Consumers need to know about it and make their own decisions in the marketplace. And whether you like it or not, that's the battle you jump into. That is the environment you climb into when you raise pastured poultry. And it may not affect you because maybe you raise 1,000 birds a year and you had no problem selling them. That's great. But what if you wanted to raise 10,000? Or what if you wanted to raise 20,000? Or what if you wanted to have a flock of 15,000 hens for eggs? That's realistically where our community is heading. Those numbers are going up. The consolidation is happening in our farms. And there's a different topic for a different day in there about diversifying the pasture poultry community at this point. But that's the reality of the pasture poultry environment we're in. So just because you raise 500 meat birds or 54 turkeys, or, you have 3 ducks and 17 hens and you have no problem selling whatever you produce, doesn't absolve the problem that is in the market. And the broader problem that's in the market is we have a lot of posers putting pressure on legitimate pasture poultry producers. And it really comes down to they're taking the decades of hard work that consumers and farmers have done to create a demand for a product, a premium product with identifiable characteristics. And they've taken that momentum and really jumped on top of it, figured out how to come into the market to capture a premium price while not actually achieving that high standard. And like it or not, that's where we are. That's where organic brought us for the last 10 years or plus. And that's where the pasture access folks are doubling down on that problem. Something will give, and we'll see where it goes. That's probably a little bit enough about the foundation of pasture. Let's look at some pasture management practices and think about housing and think about the actual outside stuff. So I'm just going to provide a couple themes or a couple ideas that I think are important as you think about shelters, because we're going to think about shelters, and you're going to build a shelter and you're going to put birds out there in shelter. And your first question is going to be, what shelter should I buy? You're going to go to Facebook and you say, what's the best pasture poultry shelter that I can build, and go. And everybody's going to be quick and happy to show you pictures of what they've done and blah, blah, blah. Snooze, right? First thing you want to do is provide species appropriate shelters. You want to protect them from the weather and predators, and you want to make the flock movement possible. You want to avoid static runs and continuous grazing. Those two kind of go hand in hand. You want to protect the flock from predators, I already mentioned, and you want to accommodate your layer and your breeder flocks in winter housing. So you need to think about all seasons, not just the pasture season. I'm going to approach this housing discussion, in a needs analysis type of principle way first. I'm not going to tell you which shelter you should buy or build, other than John's stress-free chicken tractor at pasturedpoultrytalk.com/John, because he'll give me a commission. He'll charge you the same price, but he'll give me a cut, so then I can afford to buy a microphone. So some other things you need to think about your planning. Remember, we started this series off with planning. We wanted to plan your business and why you were doing it and who you might be targeting as a customer, right? Getting you to think about the end game of your business. Well, this is planning your pasture piece of it, right? And to do that, you need to know some numbers. You can never avoid numbers, because chickens are all about numbers. Here's some basic guidelines, right? These are starting points that you can adjust based on kind of the bird, the season, temperature, etc. But if I have meat birds, say I have some beautiful Cornish cross meatballs, and I'm going to move them in a Joel Salatin style shelter every single day, they're out on pasture, I'm going to give those birds 1.5 square foot of space inside that shelter. So that means if I have 120 square foot, everybody hopefully knows how you calculate square footage. It's the width times the length of your shelter. So a 10 by 12 will give you 120. If I divide that by 1.5, that's 80 birds. That's stocked pretty tightly for Cornish cross as they get up into that 7-week range. Probably a little bit too tightly, but nevertheless, if you're processing in that 6 to 7 week range, you could probably go 1.5. Going to work out pretty well. If you are going to graze them a little bit bigger and you go 2 square foot, or maybe it's the middle of August in Pennsylvania, and that's the hot time of year where it gets up to 95 with 80% humidity, then 2 square foot is probably a safe bargaining number. And as in these little side diversions, catch the nuance of the variance here. So this is not a prescriptive recipe I'm giving you. This is a guide and things to think about. That my things have a purpose. So listen carefully. So if you're in the heat, then 2 square foot is probably a better space at market weight. If you have 120 square foot shelter, that gives you 60 birds, right? Simple math. And of course, if you're going to take birds bigger than that or longer than that, then you're going to probably eke it out to 3 square foot. So if you, for example, if you have layers or some heritage birds inside of your 120 foot square shelter, as you crest 8 weeks and hit 10 and go into 16, better just plan for a minimum of 3, and you can watch the birds and see how they react and behave. And if you got heritage birds that are, in that 14, 16, 20 week range, you're gonna need more space. You better be thinking probably closer to 5 to give them the freedom and the space to move around in some kind of fully enclosed but floorless, moveless type of pen. Right? Makes sense. If you're going to confine your turkeys, as they grow, as they get close to market weight, probably if you're going to keep them entirely enclosed, then you're looking at probably 7 square foot of space. They can tolerate some tight densities. As long as they're not shoulder to shoulder, they do pretty well. But you want to give them room to express themselves and be turkeys. So 7 is probably a reasonable starting point there for your square foot requirements. And I would say turkeys are one of those places where I use a hybrid model. So from week 6, when I take them out of the brooder to like week 10 or 11, I have them confined in a daily move shelter. And then they're big enough at that point that not a lot of stuff's going to eat them, unless it's coyote, and then you're just hosed. I let them out and range them inside of electric netting from Premier. That's the one style of housing that you have there. Those numbers change and get a little bit different if you're going to use some kind of range model. And range model here, it just simply means, to me, it means a house with a defined pasture area. So that's usually fenced off pasture, right? They're not just free to run at will. And that model works really well for turkeys and layers and breeders. The paddocks can be rotated. They're confined, so you still get the management focus of those birds. You get the protection of the fence line and keep them in a place. And the frequency of movement here, this is what gives you a longer lead time or longer movement cycle. You might give, if, for example, you gave your laying hens 20 square foot of pasture space, that might last them 5 days or 7 days, depending on the quality of your pasture. And you got to use your eyeballs here and your senses, and you got to manage the impact that they have, because you want the impact on the soil for sure, but you also don't want to let them in there too long in one spot to where they take away all the vegetation. Now, I'm actually doing this very thing with some of my birds in the chicken woods at the moment. I'm actually letting them strip away whatever green stuff is there. And there's not a lot there to begin with, but we're going to come behind them and cut down some trees and then try to reseed behind them and establish a better pasture for next year. But in general, unless you have something deliberate in mind, you don't want to denude your pasture. So that requires the movement and getting them out of there. And so if you got a really crappy pasture that hasn't been built up yet, you may need to move them every couple of days instead of every week. Or if you need to move them every week, then you need to give them a bigger space so they can spread out and minimize the impact. So just some different approaches there in the two broad models. And just know this brings in the space requirement. Pastured poultry, I don't usually advocate pastured poultry equals some kind of magic space number. And if you pay attention to marketing out there in the world today, you'll see companies market 108 square foot of pasture as their definition for pastured poultry. And this is the egg people. And really what they do is they sacrifice, they make a trade-off. They trade the movement piece of the model for space. And that's a wonky, half-hearted, kind of deceitful trade-off, in my opinion. They just functionally don't do the same thing. So anybody who's raised chickens knows this. It is what it is. We call that stuff I just talked about the stocking density guidelines. Say you want to raise 50 birds in a batch, and you want to build the John Siskovich stress-feed chicken tractor that you can get at pasturepoultrytalk.com/John. then how many shelters do you need, right? I'm not going to tell you. You're going to figure out that answer based on the information I told you, right? That's why we give you the information. That's the planning piece of it. So when you go and build your shelter, you've decided what you want. Maybe you want the Salatin pen. Maybe you're gonna build some other hoop house. Pasture Life has some really great designs. I actually have one of those in progress. I've actually purchased some 10 by 12 angle iron shelters that I'll put up some pictures out on the show notes of the podcast here. For my meat birds is what I've actually decided on. They're a little bit, I like the metal approach is what I've kind of decided back in the earlier part of the spring. So I bought some of those, or maybe you go out and you buy a commercial solution from, the range coops or the schooners or one of the mobile chicken houses from Cliff Stoltzfus. Whatever it is, the stocking densities give you an idea of how much of that housing you need and what you can push. But if you're going to build your own shelter, here's what you need to be thinking about. And when you shop for plans and look at plans on the internet, because you asked the really great question, show me your shelters. You need ability to move the birds to unsoiled pasture. You need protection from the weather, including shade. It needs to be well ventilated, which usually isn't a problem on pasture. It needs to have enough space to accommodate the entire flock. It needs roost space where appropriate. And if you have layers and breeders, you need nest boxes. And it needs to protect the flock from predators. It's a pretty straightforward list. I mean, movement, protection from weather, shade, protection from weather and predators, ventilated for airflow, space to live, roosts and nest boxes as needed. You do that. If you shop and build a shelter that can accommodate those ideas, you have something that works for your flock. You just have to build it. And I know building is the harder part. Now, I did mention ventilation, and I mentioned it's not really a problem on pasture. But I'm going to detour here because there are some draft issues that we face. And it got a weird story. I was on I do an Ask Apple call a number of years ago. Somebody called up and they said, my birds are piling at night. They're suffocating. Okay. That's unfortunate, right? And so the caller is describing the problem and then I hear it. I hear every evening I go out there and I put them in buckets. I'm like, whoa, you put them in what? He put them in buckets. This guy flat out put his broilers in buckets. And because it was cold. The temperatures were cold and he was trying to protect them. So you get a point for acknowledging the problem and paying attention to the problem and actually trying to solve it. That's good, in my opinion. You lose a point for putting them in buckets. You lose another point for telling somebody that you put them in buckets, right? Because hopefully we're all aware enough to realize that you don't put your chickens in buckets at night. And if you do, you don't tell anybody about it. You eat that mistake. You take it to your grave. I'm not really kidding a whole lot there. So, but anyway, that brings up a problem, and it's a problem I encountered in a workshop that I presented on one time where somebody was talking about birds piling in their shelters and trying to figure out why. And it comes down to drafts. Both answers in this case, both scenarios here comes down to drafts. And you guys see them. If you ask for pictures of shelters in your favorite Facebook group or you see them online, you're going to see these shelters that barely have a roof on, right? They're both ends are open and really each side is usually open at the bottom. And they just got this tarp that covers 3/4 of the roof of the shelter. Those things are great when you're in the middle of summer and it's hot and you don't got a lot of rain and life is good. But if you use that thing in weather or in the cooler weather when it's fall in Pennsylvania or it's spring in Pennsylvania and the wind is blowing in a 40-degree rain and the draft is humming right through the middle of your pasture shelter, you know what your birds are going to do? They're going to pile and kill each other and suffocate each other if they're small enough, and if they're big enough, they're just going to hurt each other, right? They're going to get ascites. They're going to have all kinds of wild problems, right? Death is what you're going to have in your pasture shelter, and it's all going to be because you didn't account for drafts. So just like your brooder is ventilated but protected from the drafts, so is your pasture shelter. Ventilation, as I mentioned, is usually not the problem. Lack of draft protection is usually a problem in a lot of pasture shelter designs. So be cognizant of that. I always recommend that when you have a shelter, when you're learning, is go out into your shelter at night when the birds are sleeping, when it's cold, when it's raining, when the wind is blowing. Make an exception for the tornadoes, but get out there in different weather patterns and conditions when the sun is at, going down over the horizon at 4:00 or getting low in the sky at 4:00, and experience what your birds are living. And if you do that, you'll understand how your shelter is either serving your birds or putting them at risk. And I think that's very important. Just get out there and spend some time with your birds. Normally, this would be a time where I would show a bunch of shelter designs. This is not a visual format, so I'm going to skip a lot of the description of the different housing models. I'm going to link out to some different designs and builds and things like that in the show notes at pasturepoultrytalk.com/108. And you can just go explore them. But basically what I want to say here, when you actually pick a shelter to build, is that the methods are many and the principles are few. I can think of several ways to make a shelter. One is lots of small shelters that you move often, every day, right? Meat birds are an example of this. We have people who use meat bird designs that range in size from 50 square foot all the way up to, 600 square foot or more, and they move every day. You have systems where you take the movement every few days because the birds have access to a bigger space of land that they can graze on over the course of time. And within that range model, you have people who follow cattle without any kind of defined paddock. It's the shelter is just moving, every few days behind the cattle, and the birds spread out and do their sanitation chores. But you have inside that range model, you have the paddock system where you create a defined paddock and you move it and rotate it. It gets crazy when you just start thinking about it here. We do have people who swear by a wheel and spoke method. I don't think this works in meat birds at all, Cornish cross specifically. Freedom Rangers, I would be hesitant to use them in there. Maybe heritage birds or breeders or maybe some layers, but we do have people that swear by the wheel and spoke, which is basically, think about a wheel with spokes like your bicycle. In the hub is where the birds live, and then every day or every couple of days, the birds get a new slice of that spoke to graze on and impact. And so they graze around the spoke and they get access to it one sliver at a time. That model was popularized. If you have APA's Green Book, I believe there's some discussions about that. Some of the ATRA publications, I think, describe that wheel and spoke method. It's not very popular because it's not really proven itself as the best method out there for managing birds on pasture or managing pasture that have birds on it. You're still fixed in location. Some people do it based on their geography and local land conditions. Your mileage may vary. Then there's the fixed barn approach, which I think probably works for very small flocks. You just don't, the danger is not utilizing the pasture very efficiently, and you will, like the wheel and spoke system, I suspect that unless you are managing the nutrients in the soil, you're probably going to have some kind of nutrient buildup in there because the birds never have anywhere else to go. But the fixed barn approach, where the pasture is accessible to the barn, and you got thousands of birds in there, 5,000-10,000 or more. That's the dangerous kind of situation. That's the 108 square feet, folks, and we just don't do that. I also did a pretty interesting podcast episode with Grady Phelan, and I'll link that in the in the notes as well for the episode that he talked about the payback period of your shelter, because at the time he was one of the first ones to use the larger mobile range coops in production, and was scaling up Cobb Creek at the time when he was there using that model. Those houses are a significant investment, and I'm not advocating that you should go out and buy them, but what I'm advocating for is knowing kind of the ROI on your shelters. So you should be able to figure out how much a shelter is going to cost you to build it or to buy it, and then how many birds, how many meat birds, or how many eggs you need to run through that system to be able in order to pay for it. The meat birds are pretty easy, right? You can take they're just a quicker flip, and so they make a really nice example. So just using an arbitrary number, let's say I purchased a shelter for $1,000, and I have a margin of $10 on my chicken. It's a really good margin. I moved to a better demographic. How many birds do I need to run through my shelter until I, quote unquote, pay for that shelter? Yeah, it would only be 100. It's not rocket science. Now, I realize you're probably not going to amortize your shelter over 100 birds. I get that. Your pricing calculations probably won't even take it over 100 birds. It'll spread it out over more. Looking at a theoretical idea here, which is I have a $10 margin. How long does it take me to pay back $1,000? It's 100 birds. Knowing that gives you some justification. Like, you'll run into this problem. It's the problem I run into is when you build something, you don't necessarily have the cash to buy it new. So you build it and you do it the best you can, but usually it takes you longer to build it because you got other stuff to do and you're not necessarily Bob the Builder, right? So you get it done and then you realize, oh, the design really stinks because I built a salatin pen out of pressure treated 2x4s and it's like 500 pounds and now I can't move it. And if I forgot the dolly part of it, I just figured I'd push it with my kid's legs. And you realize that doesn't work. So you screwed it up anyway. So now you're out the time and the money and the labor, and what do? You do it again. There's always a trade-off of that time you do it and the investment you make for yourself and just buying it, just hiring it done, which is something that Grady used to always talk about on the podcast, is hiring it done. And when you buy a house, that's what you do. You hire it done. And there's an economic equation there. And it frees you up to have opportunities to make money or to do other things that need to be done that better suit your talents. So this idea of buying versus building, you gotta make that decision based on your local needs. Let's think a little bit about eggmobiles here for a moment. There's a lot of ways to run eggmobiles on pasture or pasture shelters. I guess the eggmobile name was popularized by Joel. That's what he called them. And you can do this in any number of ways. Repurpose, running gears, buy Titleist trailers on Craigslist, repurpose stock trailers that you gut and reskin and repurpose. Some people do RVs. I really don't like the RV approach. They're just pretty flimsy and it seems like a lot of more work in deconstruction and stuff than it's worth, but to each their own. There's an idea here about density and stocking. So if you're going to run an eggmobile where the birds are actually going to be outside the house ranging on pasture each day, then, in other words, not confined to like a chicken tractor, then the question becomes, how much space do I need inside my house? And I'm going to tell you that 1 square foot is usually a pretty good number for most layers. You're going to look at that because you're going to get to a size of your flock, and it's going to make you pucker up when you start calculating how much shelter space you need to scale up your flock. And you're going to be like, well, I don't really want to do that because that's expensive, and you're going to want to do something different. But 1 square foot buys you space. It buys you mistakes. Just like in your brooder, if you remember that conversation, why do you give your chicks and your poults an extra quarter square foot of space, for example? Why do you give them one when they might be able to get away with a half or 3/4 of a square foot, right? And it's that idea of you're buying protection. When things go wrong, things will really go wrong, and having crowding stress will compound whatever went wrong, and you'll see that by dead birds cannibalize birds. So that's what 1 square foot does inside your eggmobile for your layers. It gives you that peace of mind. I've seen people run, birds in their house all the way down to, quarter of a square foot to a third of a square foot per indoor space for their birds. But it's very important for all those birds to be able to get in to the shelter at one time at night to lock them up, and for inclement weather and things like that. That's my recommendation. 1 square foot inside the eggmobile, plus the outside pasture. You do less when you have more experience. And when you're looking at layers, a couple considerations, I kind of glossed over them there in the initial shelter requirements, but roosts. So here are some numbers. So if you ever want to know layer numbers in terms of how many roosts and nest boxes, get out your pen right now and write it down. Roosts, 8 inches per hen, about 3 foot off the ground, a little less maybe. And they should be all at the same height so they don't fight each other or fight for dominance. So basically, to put that in perspective, 200 birds require 1,600 inches of roost space, which is 133 linear feet of roost bars. Nest boxes, 1 box per 5 hens is usually what I operate on. Some people will go a little bit lighter than that, maybe 7 or so. Rollouts are nice. People seem to be all the rage, the community rollouts. I have a couple of those. They work okay. Here's what I would say about that is don't ever give your birds a choice between a conventional nest box with bedding in it and a rollout nest box with AstroTurf as the bedding material, because they will choose the bedding, the conventional nest box with the bedding in it every single time. And with your nest boxes, just make sure that they have curtains on them, which keeps the space dark, discourages sharing, discourages loafing. And in the show notes here, I'll have some links to some pretty good layer builds and plans and ideas and stuff. And so I think you really like it. In both cases, layers and meat birds, the Pastured Poultry shelter innovations, the people who are building shelters have really come a long way over the last, since I've been with APA, which is, 10 years or so. Just the improvements and the innovations that have happened in the space is incredible. It's one of the things that I look at and I'm just most in awe about the way, because what it's done is it's allowed our community flocks to scale up. We have people doing hundreds of thousands of meat birds and tens of thousands of layers on pasture in a movement-based system, in part because of technologies in fencing. Sure, that's been there for a long time, but technologies in housing and feed, which has been growing. But the housing piece of it is catching up, and it's enabling flock sizes to scale. And it's every time I see one of these new companies come into the model who haven't ever spent much time in the Pastured Poultry community say that they can't scale up in a movement-based model, which is the reason they have to go to a barn model. I just want to reach out and break an egg on their face, because it's just not true. It's not where we're at today. And unless you're a part of a group like APA, you may not see that. You may not see that innovation, because not that APA is the only place that it is, but APA is the place where that stuff is usually out in front by a couple years. So let's wrap up our conversation here with predators. In full disclosure, I really don't like predators. I'm a fan of shooting them if they're a problem. I'm a fan of ignoring them if they're not a problem. So even though I'm a victim of predation from time to time, some years are worse than others. I've had a rougher year this year with predators than I have in previous years in my layer flock. My meat birds, my initial meat birds of the year went off with no predation. And they were in the chicken woods. So there's not always an easy rhyme or reason to the challenges you have, but it's been a rough year for layers for me. I've had some skunk and I've had some fox, and I was so delighted because I drove into my driveway or was turning onto the road that goes into my driveway here a couple of days ago. And I'm like, what is that on the road? I'm like, a roadkill of something, but it didn't look quite like a raccoon or a possum or something like that. So I walked up there, and to my delight, it was a red fox. And I know this red fox has victimized me, and so I don't really mind that he's laying on the road right now. And I took a picture of him to celebrate the momentous occasion. Now, generally, I like foxes. I like seeing them, but in this case, I consider it a win. And I did have protections in place, but I had I had some problems and whatever. But here's the point: when you put chickens out on pasture, it is your responsibility to protect that flock. Will you be successful every single night? No. Is it your job to plan for the predators? Yes. Is it your job to adapt and manage the situations that you find yourself in? Yes. So predator control is really about planning for it, taking your best step forward, and then layering on solutions if you experience problems. So it's a layered approach. It's a never-ending approach. And the irony here, one of the things that when APA releases its video called, I'm going to give away the title here. You're going to hear it first on this podcast. When APA releases its fourth video in the Real Pastured Poultry series called Pastured Poultry Ecosystems Coexist with Wildlife, you're going to note that, first of all, the video really describes and really captures the heart of what pastured poultry is, more than any of the other videos did. But you're going to notice that the theme in that video is really about the coexistence of a natural production model, pastured poultry, with the rest of the environment, the ecosystem. And what you find in that video is you'll see the farmers talking about controlling predators, but you also talk about the role that a healthy ecosystem brought about by the pastured poultry management style brings with it. So with healthy soil, with healthy pasture, springs to life lots of other animals, whether that's butterflies or coyotes or hawks or grasshoppers, or pick something, right? It's an entire ecosystem, and it's working in balance, and you're actually stimulating it. There's an irony here. Every time I watch that video, I think of the irony of, predation is always a risk on pasture. But when you actually do pasture poultry and you improve your soil and your pasture and you create a healthier environment, you might actually make your predation problem worse. And I think that's what happens when you look at people who have severe eagle pressure like white oak does. They have eagles galore. They weren't there forever, right? They've created a healthy ecosystems that the birds find very attractive. And it's not just because there's chickens there. It's because the entire ecosystem is rebounding. And so that's a heady thing to wrap your head around, but it is your responsibility to protect them. And you shouldn't ever be surprised. You can be sad, but you should never be surprised when something eats your chicken, because everything's going to try. And so how do you protect them? Well, first of all, you do it with shelters, right? So that's why a lot of folks will opt for the Daily Move pasture shelter, right? It has a management perspective to it, but there's a protection angle too. When you have birds inside a shelter that has 4 walls and a roof and it's level to the ground, that's going to thwart most of your predators. You might have still some that can burrow and dig, but they're generally not going to wipe you out in a night. You're going to thwart the aerial stuff. So shelter design is a first layer. One of the roughest experience I've had with layers before this year was with owls and the great horned owl. And I'd get lazy. Usually you go through life and you're lackadaisical in my case, and you won't shut your hens up at night. And you go back the next day and everything's good. And then all of a sudden you do that for a while and you forget that you're supposed to lock the birds up at night, because, it gets dark at like 9:30 and the hens are still out scratching around till 9, and your chicken woods is 1/8 of a mile away. So you just let them ride. And then all of a sudden you come out one night and you find a headless chicken strewn about somewhere, and you're like, crap. So you got to lock them up. And so you get that question, like number one question I see about predation with layers is, how do I stop owls from eating my chickens? The simple answer, I mean, it's like, who's buried in Grant's tomb, right? You lock them up. If you don't want the owl to eat your chicken, you lock them up. And even when I did lock them up, sometimes I missed one. Like there'd be one locked, squirreled away near a tree somewhere or under the shelter that I missed. But generally, you lock them up. You use the shelter as a line of defense, and you close the door and you make sure there's no entry point. And voila, you've just protected your flock at night. And that's probably kind of the easiest one to do, quite honestly. The tougher ones become, what do you do with those waning hour kind of twilight times of day, when everything's active, the raptors, the canines and stuff like that. And so other guards against predation, guard animals, right? Guard dogs being the most prevalent because they can be trained to chickens. Not all of them are trained to chickens, but you can get some that work with chickens, and they are usually ferocious and shut down the risk. There, lots of people are using geese as in the same way. They're more of an alert system. They're not going to attack or drive away a predator necessarily with force, but they are going to alert the rest of the flock. They're going to make noise. They're going to be big. And that's going to be a lot of times good enough to thwart the threat, or at least divert it. So guard animals are part of it. If you are in an area with high pressure, then simply having an electric fence, a portable fence from Premier, which you can find more information about Premier at pasturedpoultrytalk.com/Premier, and having it electrified will do a lot of good with deterring ground predators. The raccoons, the possums, the fox, coyotes will jump a fence if they really want you bad enough. Those are the core approaches to predation. It's a good idea, even before you have a problem, to set up a trail camera in your area. Like pick a travelway or pick an area near your shelter and just film it. And then you can monitor the camera every couple of days. And if you have problems, you can check the camera for predators. But definitely, if you're trying to identify a predator, a trail camera, it's worth its weight. It's worth whatever you have to pay for a good one to take pictures at night, take identifiable pictures at night, because then you can look at it and you can identify your threat. And once you identify your threat, you can find somebody that helps you minimize it. There's nothing worse than coming out to your shelter or coming out to your pasture and finding birds strewn around. I've had raccoons that just have harassed ducks in a hoop house for 3 hours until they finally found a way to free a duck. Only to kill it, of course. But you know what I mean? Like predators sometimes have nothing better to do than be persistent. And their persistence is every single night. And sometimes it's for hours each night. And in that scenario, they only have to be successful one time. You have to thwart that predator every minute of every day for the life of that bird. So you're at a disadvantage. But many of us believe that the risk of the predation is worth the payout. And the payout of all those benefits of the pasture model that we talked about, the foundation of pasture, we believe it's worth the risk. And so it's up to us to mitigate that risk and work within the broader ecosystem that pastured poultry fits into, and sometimes actually builds, right? The ecosystem comes to life a lot of times as a result of the pastured poultry method of production that we use. And that's the benefit of, and what I would say on the predation, because this is a talking point of the critics of the model. This is a talking point of the proponents of stick them in a barn and close the door and turn off the natural sunlight, right? And that's, we're going to keep our birds safe inside the barn, right? We don't want something eating our chickens. That's irresponsible. But what happens usually is, and what has happened historically, let me say it that way, is by taking the birds out of the natural environment and putting them into a artificial indoor environment where they remove access to soil and grass and sun, and everything's 100% fed to them, man-made feed, and they're in tightly confined spaces, you substitute predation risk for health risk, for disease and more antibiotic use and more medications and a sacrifice in welfare because the chicken isn't going to be able to express its natural instincts inside the barn. They're going to be tightly stocked. So there's a stress factor. So you're making a trade-off. Just because you can keep the bird alive using medicine or antibiotics or whatever, or doesn't mean that you're giving the bird a better life because it may get eaten by a hawk out in the pasture. There's a trade-off and there's a management, and it really comes down to what risk are you willing to mitigate and manage against. And just like having birds inside of a fancy barn doesn't protect them from avian influenza or Marek's or pick a disease, right? Pick a poultry disease. It doesn't protect them just by being in the barn. Your birds won't automatically be protected from predators when they're outside. Don't buy into the marketing hype of the pasture poultry naysayers who argue that it's the predation risk is too great to have birds outside. That's just baloney. It's lazy thinking, and it's hopefully get you a few ideas here about pasture management, the housing, the shelters, and what you need to do on it. And I'll give you my personal takes on housing to use and when. For meat birds, Cornish cross, I'm almost 100% daily move. I want those birds in a chicken tractor. I'm going to move them every day. If I'm raising Freedom Rangers or my other favorite bird, which is the Sassos, the naked necks that I can't get anymore, I'm more than likely going to day range them. I'm going to stock them a little bit heavier in the house and just let them range a little bit because they do pretty good feed conversion wise, even when they're ranging. So meat bird, 2 different models. That way I don't have to move my house and my fences every couple of days. I don't think there's any labor benefit there, right? There's no labor savings really from a daily move and a day range to style shelter. It all comes out pretty closely in the wash pretty much every time I've seen it. Some people have better systems than others, and it may be slightly better one way or the other. But for me, it's a pretty even wash. When I'm raising hens, right now I have hens in my chicken woods. I've had some predation threats down there. Dealt with some skunk issues, believe it or not. And so I move away from the house where I am under skunk and fox pressure down to the woods where I run into more skunks. So anyway, I'm in a daily move shelter right now with my hens. I would prefer to have them ranging inside of electric netting. That's my preference. But the predator pressure right now and the ability to control their impact into a certain area where before I cut down some trees and reseed, they're in the chicken tractor. Turkeys, I already mentioned. I do the hybrid model. I do from out of the brooder at 6 weeks through 10 or 11 weeks on pasture is going to be daily moved because they're really small at that point. They're still pretty vulnerable, and I'll keep them that way. And then they'll get so big eventually that nothing's going to really mess with them except the alpha predators, like humans or coyotes or bears or something like that. But then I'll let them range. I'll let them out of the house and let them in their paddock and move them every couple of days, every week or so. And that's how I do it. The geese I have, I right now I have 2 guard geese inside a perimeter fence for my hens. I'm still moving the hens in my tractor, but the geese are outside in the perimeter inside the net, and they just hang out. They just do their own thing. And then I have the rest of my geese, the other breeder set and the offspring are up close to the house, and they're just cruising around inside net. I'm just moving them around some scrubby areas, and they're mowing down grass. Like, they're phenomenal grazers. So I just give them some corn every once in a while and maybe a scoop of grain if they're eating their grass down and I don't get them moved. But they're primarily doing vegetation control right now because I'm not mowing. It's been hot and dry, so I haven't had to mow anyway. But I have some lower areas, some stuff that's grown up that needed to be taken care of. And so rather than mow it, my geese are actually doing it. So I'm moving geese through. I have a couple sections of electric netting that we're just moving along a hillside, and they're doing a phenomenal job taking care of that grass. That's what I do personally. For whatever that's worth, I hope this has been a little educational, enjoyable, entertaining even. And if you are in need of a pastured poultry shelter and you're just not quite sure which one to build, give some thoughts about your landscape. And I would like to see questions from you that were better than tell me what the best shelter is or show me your pictures of your shelters. Think about what your space needs. Do you have narrow gates? Do you have narrow alleyways in the trees? Do you have a lot of predator pressure? Do you have hills do you have to contend with? That kind of stuff. Are you able to get out to lock your hens up at night? Is it convenient? Can you do that without sacrificing their life because you're lazy and you don't want to go down to I'm lazy and I don't want to go down to the woods at 9:00 at night to do it. So those are the questions, right? You think about it. And sometimes you don't know those questions until you really do it the first time. So that's why it makes sense to just always start small, always start with a reasonable size that you can afford to lose and learn on in those first ones. And you'll get the hang of it. I think most housing iterations go by pretty quickly. Like right now I'm on, I've started out using an overbuilt Salatin shelter that didn't last more than a year. And then I found a hoop house that I liked, which was a Robert Plamondon style hoop house that I really like. I've also built the Hanson style hoop house, which is a little bit different in design. I didn't like that one as much. So that's 3 shelters right there. I built a Harvey Ussery A-frame out of Harvey's book. I use that one still. That's okay. It's pretty short, but it's pretty good as a bullpen shelter, as a backup that I can slap some hens in when I need them. So that's 4 shelters right there. I'm building a 10 by 10 EMT conduit that I want to put some of the breeders in for the next season. And I have some other 10 by 8s or 8 by 10 metal buildings that I purchased that were prefabbed, and I really like them a lot. That's probably going to be the design that I focus on for most of my production type birds. And I'm to the point now where I'm happy enough to buy them so that's what I got, folks. Thank you for hanging in with your ears. Lots of resources in this episode. You can check them all out at pasturedpoultrytalk.com/108. Be nice to people. Be nice to everybody. Love your neighbor and have a great rest of the summer, folks. Thanks.